This land is mine, God gave this land to me. I do remember this tremendous column of men, nearly 10,000 men of the Highland Division and the French Army. Soldiers were taken prisoners and walking with us. The French soldiers at this time from St Valery area, I remember them waving to their families as they were marched away to be prisoners of war. And when the morning sun reveals the hills and plains. If one stopped out of line at this time, the Germans on motorbikes who would fire a shot straight at you, and you couldn't stop to do toilet or to do anything else while we was on this march. So it was very uncomfortable for everybody. So take my hand and walk this land with me. At this time we were marching all day long and had no idea where we were going. Eventually we was to land up onto the River Rhine, but before that we had to go through northern France, Belgium, and onto the Rhine before we could go into what we thought was going to be a camp. We arrived there and straight away we were put into barges, coal barges, onto the Rhine River, which sailed down in through to Germany. This was not very good because down in the holes we were shut in and had no idea where we were going. The barges were towed down the river. We were packed into dirty holes of these barges so tight that we could not only but stand up, and our journey took at least 4 days, but we had no idea where we were and had no idea what our end would be. We were then put into cattle wagons, about 100 men to each wagon, and from then on we just journeyed across Europe somewhere. We had no idea at that time. Stops were made at different periods so that they could get off the trucks to exercise their legs, but we were soon moved on again and given very little rations. We travelled for about 3 days and then found we was in a part of Poland. And when we finally arrived there, we was at a camp in Posen for prisoners of war, which was Stalag 21B. We had very hard times there because they had no accommodation for us, and we just slept on concrete slabs. With the help of God, I know I can be strong. This land is mine, God gave this land to me. He was lucky if they found a horse which had been shot or laid in the fields for a while, and that was clean, then put in the pot, and you was lucky to have a bit of meat if if that was your turn. Food was very hard to come by because they had so many prisoners to contend with, and they never visualised that they'd had literally thousands and thousands of men to deal with like that. And when the morning sun reveals the hills and plains. Cattle wagons, around there on straight floors, no palliasses except for nothing but a few clothes. And except for the uniform you stood in, everything was taken away from you at that point. So we was just as we were with nothing at all, no equipment, no kettles, no mugs to drink tea with, nothing. So things were very bad at that time.
So take my hand and walk this land with me.
When we reached the prisoner of war camp into Thorn, was a prisoner of war camp, we were detailed one day to go to a synagogue, and there inside was nothing but British uniforms and all clothing for servicemen. At this time we were in quite bad conditions and had even Dutch clogs on, as we'd got no army boats. But while we was there, we made certain that we got several of the items to take back to the camp with us before the Germans found out. And that was in 1940. Later on, as we moved from the first camp, we went to another one called Shubin, and from there was 20,000 men at the prisoner of war camp, and that was a stalag. And from there we was detailed work to go out in parties of 100 men to work on building sites, canals and watercourses and other things very similar to that, all part of draining the land for agriculture. We were miles away from anywhere at this time, and a couple of men tried to escape, and we were paraded and addressed by the commandant. Accompanied by Germans on motorcycles with mounted machine guns. It was clear they meant business when they said, "You've got to tell us where these men are." But we had no idea where they were. But next day they turned up, and the Germans then machine gunned the two men in front of us to make certain that we realised that there was no good escaping here, as she would have a worse time. And that wasn't very nice to be standing there and seeing men shot.
Oh, I am just a man when you are by my side. With the help of God, I know I can be strong.
There it was entirely different because we was then on small farms with about 10 men working in different parts of the village. Some were working on the railway lines, some in the forest, others working on lakes in the winter time where we would be getting the ice from there so that they could store the ice for further purposes in shops. While working there, we was close to the railway line and repairing the railway track. We saw many times troops coming either one way or the other, and most of them were coming back from the Russian front, having been in the winter severely frostbitten, with no serious injuries other than frostbite. On the other hand, the frostbite can be very bad for you because it eventually takes over and freezes your whole body if nobody's there to help you out. We've been in marshalling yards along the railway track and seen at different times trainloads of political prisoners who were stopped just to let the people get out and throw out or pass out the people who had died in the railway carriages. These were mostly women at the time of 1943 44, but we didn't know where that train was going, or no idea at that time that there were such things as concentration camps. This went on for all the war until the end of the war.
How do you describe some quite awful things to have witnessed? How did you protect yourself, protect your mind?
Oh, well, at one small camp we had enough, 10 of us there, and 4 of us could play instruments. And we was fortunate enough to be able to get through the local agency their instruments. So we had a couple of cornets, a saxophone and a drum kit, and we managed to make our own entertainment in that small camp, which we were there for several years.
So music kept spirits high, and you managed to somehow bring a drum kit and other musical instruments in?
Brought them through the guards, asking the German guards where they could get the instruments from, which they done, and we paid for them with the wages what they paid us, which was a German mark. That was very, very nice to be able to play an instrument with the 2 or 3 chaps to entertain. But mostly it was a very long, at that time we never knew, or we had no idea how long we would be there. The mail didn't come through very well. If you're on a small working party, then you're away from the main stalags. Consequently, you get left behind. If you're in the main camps, the mail come frequently. The Red Cross parcels and all things, clothing, is delivered there. But on a working party, you're miles, hundreds of miles away from a stalag or from any army camp. So you don't come off so well as regards to the clothes what you've got. The letters you would write to your parents was inquiring about other members of the family to see where your people were, whether they was being bombed, which we had no idea. And as the years went by, which was years, it got more awful all the time. Several of the chaps in the 1942 and 3 time had been away so long from their family that they just couldn't figure out how they was ever going to get back home or we would win the war. In Stalag 21B in Elbing, North Poland, we was working on the railway, and we used to run the railway right along the coast. And many days at this particular point, there were loads of trains going past on what was called the small Kleinbahn, or the small railway. And this was about 3 miles from our camp. And the coaches come along every day, seemed to be full of women going to we didn't know where. But we did find eventually that they were going to an extermination camp called Stutthof. Now, we was in a village called Stegen, which was about 3 miles from Stutthof. And all the while we was there, we never realised that there was a camp for this sort of thing. But at the end of the war, the Russians claimed this camp, and we have not heard anything since that day.
So in later years, as history has been told, you obviously discovered what these camps were all about, the extermination camps.
Yeah, I've got details here, but that was nothing to do with me, really, you know, of all the atrocities what they in that camp. As I mentioned in the beginning of this interview, in 1940 we marched or walked a long way across Europe to get to the Rhine. And then 5 years later, in 1945, with the prospects of the Russians coming from the east, the Germans decided to march us westward again. We started east of Danzig. We skirted the city and continued west right across northern Germany and nearly into Hamburg. We were the first people on this particular march in that part of the country. The march took place in awful conditions. This was in 1944, December. At that time I was 24 years old. We had much older men walking with us and guarding us, and when we saw a man's nose or ears going white, we would rub their ears and nose to get the circulation back. If you didn't do that, they would have to go to hospital and perhaps lose an ear or nose or whatever happened. Nobody made any attempt to escape because the weather was so bad, and no one left the column because they would die in the cold, which was extremely bad at that winter of 44-45. The very bad winter continued all the while we were on the march, and some of the lads were so bad that they just passed away on the roadside because no hospital treatment, no ambulance, no first aid was ever possible in that conditions because nobody knew where we were. Occasionally we slept in the open air, but it was very cold. We slept in large barns, sometimes on farms, and we walk in and drop to sleep on the hay because we were so exhausted with no food and extremely cold. The worst thing about this was that chaps who were so hungry would grab a turnip or a mangle as we went through the fields to eat it, and it was frozen, and this really upset their stomachs. They would go to the toilet 2 or 3 times during the night in the barns, and some ended up passing blood followed by dysentery, from which many had died, and we had this all the time on the road.
If I must fight, I'll fight to hold.
So nearly every other night I would be sounding the trumpet, which I had as from the prisoner of war days, to sound off the last post. But these graves could never be found because they was in the roadside in a field somewhere in North Germany.
Until I die, this land is mine.
While we was in Brunswick, we spent several days there, glad of when the Americans came and released us. Although there was nowhere to go and they could do nothing, we were certainly freed of the guards which we had with us on all the winter on the long march we had. And they were then made to surrender, and they left on the table their revolvers, swords, and anything which was useful to kill anybody, and they were sent away, which we never saw them again. At this point, one of the officers said, "Here's a sword here," and I happened to be right there, and I picked up that sword, and I still have it to the present day. So, although it doesn't see much daylight, because the wife would never let me hang that up on the wall, that was what was kept in the cupboard. But that was the only thing I brought back, except for myself, from Germany, and the trumpet.
send it down, and your wages get it down, hand me down my silver trumpet, Lord.
So when we left Brunswick, we was then passed over to Hanover. And we picked up there on the airfield there, such as it was, a C-47 Dakota American plane, and was then flown to Brussels. In Brussels we stayed for a while, and I did go and get myself a few drinks while we was in Brussels to make up for lost time. And then from Brussels we was then pushed over to High Wycombe as our repatriation place, and this was about a week before we knew that the war was going to finish, and we was kitted out with the necessary new uniforms and everything. And on the day before the E-Day, I arrived home in where I lived then in Kingsland in Norfolk. At the end of the war, and we was then being put on the planes at Hanover, and my mate, who I'd fallen in with on the march, and who was very poorly and very sick and quite much older than me, I volunteered to carry what little kit he had, and on the march that helped him. When we left each other, because he was then put in with the people who were sick and invalided, and I said to him, I'll see you another time, and he said, take my name and address, and any time you're in London, call in. Well, it so happened several years later, after 45, a couple of years anyway, that I was going on special duties to Sherwood Forest to pick up prisoners of war, which then were German officers, to take them back to London. And I had time to call in to Kentish Town, which I'd never been to before, to visit my mate. And he lived in a part of North London, so I knew exactly the street he lived. So I shouted up one morning at about 9 o'clock and knocked on the door, and who turned up but this chap who I was a prisoner of war with for a time. And he said, come in, and away we went up into this apartment that he had there. And also there were two young ladies. They weren't his sisters or anything, they was just friends from Cornwall. And these two girls were going up to the Isle of Skye to see relations up there. Anyway, while I was there, that was briefly, I said, well, there's a nice young lady here, I'll try and keep in contact, which I did through letter writing and on the old telephone in the evenings. And after a short while we got quite friendly, and I went down to Cornwall where she lived, which I'd never been before. I gave a whistle, and up in the top flat a head came out and said, glad to see you, and threw the keys down for me to come in through the front door. We hadn't seen each other for several months. And while we was chatting away, two girls were also in that house at the time. They were on holiday from Cornwall. Both worked for the Western National Bus Company. Florrie, who was a bus conductor from Porthallow, and Joyce Merrifield worked in the company office in Wendron Street, Helston. I didn't know the girls at that time, but after a while I got in contact with Florrie, and while I was up in Scotland we got to know each other quite well, and I came down to Cornwall a couple of times, and eventually, a few months later, actually in 1947, we got married. And that was all due to my friend Dick. When we lived in St Kevin, I was very interested still in music, and within a week I joined St Kevin Band. At the same time, being as I was able and young, or youngish, I joined the football club. So for several years I played for St Kevin in the football team and joined the band. Also all happened over the period of Christmas 1950. And after a few years in the band, they made me deputy bandmaster, which I'd been then for a number of years as deputy bandmaster with St Kevin Band. And I thoroughly enjoyed my time there because the Section 4 to the Championship, St Kevin have done it all. They've been in each section while that time was there. While I've been in St Kevin Band, of which I'm still quite attached to, I've had 18 bandmasters to talk to at different times, and they all have different ideas. Some of them were very good ideas, others, well, they got passable, but I always looked on the bandmaster, he's here today and gone tomorrow. So I said, the bandsmen are there always. So my life with St Kevin Band has taken up 60 odd years since I've been down here, and I've had a thoroughly good time there with them. And my wife has always worked hard with them for every engagement what we've had, saving up for this and buying music and buying instruments, and also our own band room, which we had for lots of years.
So from being a bandsman with your regiment right through to meeting Florrie, happening to come down to Cornwall.
And down to Cornwall, yeah, and I've been here ever since. And that's only last year that I finished going out helping with the young children with the present bandmaster, Gareth Churcher, which was very, very good.
So when you look back, you're almost 96 in June, Eric. It's
Yeah.
quite a story you've got to tell, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I don't know.